The scent of blood never fully washed away, no matter how hard Zara Garrett scrubbed her hands in the creek behind the boarding house where she worked. And today was no different as she knelt on the muddy bank in Medicine Bow, Wyoming. Her fingers raw and trembling from the effort of trying to erase memories that lived beneath her skin. The year was 1878, and the town had grown around the Union Pacific Railroad like a stubborn weed, attracting cowboys, gamblers, and men who believed the West was lawless enough to hide their sins. Zara had learned otherwise. The law might be slow in these parts, but justice had a way of catching up, even if it wore a badge made of tin instead of silver. She dried her hands on her apron and stood, her legs unsteady beneath her skirts. The boarding house loomed behind her, a two-story structure that had seen better days, its paint peeling like sunburned skin. Mrs. Calloway, the owner, was kind enough, but kindness only stretched so far when you were a woman alone with a past that followed you like a shadow. Zara had been in Medicine Bow for 3 months, having fled from a mining town in Colorado where her husband had finally drunk himself to death. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt nothing but the constant tremor in her hands that reminded her of 5 years spent flinching at every sound, every raised voice, every sudden movement. The sun was setting over the Laramie Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that might have been beautiful if Zara had allowed herself to notice such things. She gathered her skirts and walked back toward the boarding house, where she would spend the evening serving supper to rough men who smelled of horses and tobacco. Most of them were respectful, but their eyes still made her skin crawl, still made her want to disappear into the floorboards. She was halfway up the back steps when she heard the commotion in the street, shouting, the sharp report of a gunshot, then the thunder of hooves. Zara froze, her hand gripping the railing so hard her knuckles went white. Not again. Please, not again. But she forced herself to move, to climb the stairs, to slip inside the kitchen where Mrs. Calloway was already peering out the front window with the curiosity of someone who had lived in the West long enough to know when to watch and when to hide. "Bank robbery, Mrs. Calloway announced, her voice matter of fact. "3rd one this month. Those Miller boys are getting bold." Zara said nothing. She tied on a clean apron and began setting plates on the long dining table, her movements mechanical. The Miller gang had been terrorizing Medicine Bow and the surrounding ranches for months, but the town marshal was old and the deputies were few. People talked about sending for help from Cheyenne, but talk was cheap and travel was expensive. The guests arrived for supper in clusters, their conversations dominated by the robbery. Zara moved among them like a ghost, filling cups and serving stew, keeping her eyes down and her mouth shut. That was how she survived. That was how she had always survived. "Heard they shot Tom Henderson in the leg," one man said, a freight hauler named Pete. "He tried to stop them coming out of the bank." "Damn fools," another man muttered. "Someone needs to put those boys down." Zara's hands trembled as she poured coffee, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the cup. She steadied herself, took a breath, and continued her rounds. Later, when the dishes were washed and the kitchen was clean, she climbed the narrow stairs to the tiny room she rented on the 2nd floor. It was barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, but it was hers and the door had a lock. That was all that mattered. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling, the creak of floorboards, the distant bark of a dog. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and full of dreams she could not remember, but that left her gasping and drenched in sweat. Morning came too early, as it always did. Zara dressed in the gray light of dawn, pinning her dark hair into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She was 23 years old, but the woman looking back at her seemed older, her brown eyes shadowed and wary. Downstairs, Mrs. Calloway was already frying bacon, the smell filling the kitchen with a warmth that did not quite reach Zara's bones. They worked in companionable silence, preparing breakfast for the guests. It was a Sunday, which meant the church crowd would come for dinner later, and Mrs. Calloway liked everything to be perfect for the ladies who wore their best dresses and judged everyone who did not. The morning passed in a blur of routine. Zara served breakfast, cleared the table, and was scrubbing a pot when Mrs. Calloway announced that she needed supplies from the general store. "Would you mind running over, dear? I have a list." Zara hesitated. She hated going into town, hated the way people looked at her, the widow woman who had appeared out of nowhere with no family and no explanations. But she nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. Of course. The general store was 3 blocks away, and Zara kept her head down as she walked, clutching the list in one hand. Medicine Bow was busy for a Sunday morning, the street crowded with wagons and horses. She was so focused on avoiding eye contact that she did not see the man until she collided with him, the impact sending her stumbling backward. "Whoa there," a deep voice said, and strong hands caught her arms, steadying her before she could fall. Zara's heart lurched into her throat. She jerked away, her breath coming fast, her hands already rising to protect her face. But the man released her immediately, stepping back with his palms raised. "Easy," he said, his voice calm. "I did not mean to startle you." Zara forced herself to look at him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean, muscular build that came from hard work. His face was tanned and weathered, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a dusty hat, a faded blue shirt, and a gun belt that sat low on his hips. A cowboy, she thought, though there was something different about him, something in the way he held himself that suggested he was more than just another ranch hand. "I am fine," Zara managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched the list tighter, her hands trembling. The man's eyes flickered to her hands, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, but understanding, as if he recognized the signs of fear when he saw them. "You sure?" he asked, his tone gentle. Zara nodded quickly and stepped around him, hurrying toward the general store. She could feel his gaze on her back, but she did not turn around. Inside the store, she gave the list to Mr. Harmon, the proprietor, and waited while he gathered the items. Her heart was still racing, her palms damp with sweat. She hated how easily fear overtook her, how even a simple kindness felt like a threat. When she left the store, her arms laden with packages, the cowboy was gone. Zara told herself she was relieved. The weeks that followed settled into the same routine. Zara worked, slept, and avoided people as much as possible. The Miller gang struck again, this time robbing a stagecoach on the road to Rawlins. 2 passengers were injured, and the town's frustration grew. There was talk of forming a vigilante committee, but nothing came of it. People were afraid, and fear made them cautious. Zara understood fear better than most. It was a Wednesday afternoon when she saw the cowboy again. She was at the creek, washing linens, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She looked up, her heart already pounding, and saw him riding along the bank. He was alone, his horse moving at an easy walk. When he spotted her, he tipped his hat. "Afternoon," he called. Zara did not respond. She turned back to the laundry, scrubbing harder. The horse stopped a few yards away, and she heard the creak of leather as the man dismounted. "Name is Gideon Abbott," he said, his voice carrying over the sound of the water. I work at the Three Bars Ranch about 10 miles north of town. Zara kept scrubbing. Go away, she thought. Please just go away. I have been meaning to apologize, Gideon continued. For startling you the other day, that was not my intention. You already apologized, Zara said, her voice clipped. I suppose I did. There was a pause, and then he said, You work at the boarding house, do not you? Zara's hand stilled. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowed. Why does it matter? Gideon held up his hands in a gesture of peace. It does not. I was just making conversation. I am not interested in conversation. He studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he nodded. Fair enough. He turned and walked back to his horse, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. Before he rode away, he looked at her one more time. If you ever need help with anything, Mrs. Calloway knows where to find me. Zara watched him ride away, her chest tight with an emotion she could not name. She did not need help. She did not need anything from anyone. That was the only way to stay safe. But as the days passed, she found herself thinking about Gideon Abbott more than she wanted to admit. There was something about the way he had looked at her, not with pity or suspicion, but with a quiet kind of respect. It unsettled her. Autumn arrived with a cold wind that stripped the leaves from the cottonwoods and sent them skittering down the main street like tiny ghosts. The boarding house was busier than usual, filled with cowhands who had finished the fall roundup and were spending their wages on hot meals and warm beds. Zara worked long hours, her exhaustion a welcome distraction from her thoughts. It was on one of those busy evenings that the Miller gang made their boldest move yet. They rode into town just after sunset, 6 men with bandanas covering their faces. They did not bother with subtlety. They stormed into the saloon, guns drawn, and demanded everyone's money. Then they moved to the general store and then to the boarding house. Zara was in the kitchen when she heard the front door slam open. She froze, a plate in her hands, as heavy footsteps echoed through the dining room. Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Stay here," she whispered, but it was too late. One of the men pushed past Mrs. Calloway and into the kitchen. He was tall and thin, with cold eyes that swept over Zara like she was something to be appraised and discarded. "What have we got here?" he drawled. Zara's hands began to shake, the plate slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The man laughed, a harsh sound that made her stomach turn. He took a step toward her, and Zara backed up until she hit the wall. "Leave her alone," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice shaking but firm. "She has nothing." The man ignored her. He reached out and grabbed Zara's wrist, and she felt the world tilt. She was back in Colorado, back in the cabin with her husband's hand around her throat, his breath reeking of whiskey. She could not breathe. She could not move. Let her go. The voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the man pause. Zara's vision cleared, and she saw Gideon Abbott standing in the doorway. He was not holding a gun, but his hand rested on the grip of the revolver at his hip. The man holding Zara's wrist sneered. "This is not your business, Cowboy." "I am making it my business," Gideon said. His eyes were hard, his jaw set. "Let her go and ride out of here. No one needs to get hurt." For a long moment the room was silent. Then the man released Zara's wrist and spat on the floor. "You are making a mistake." "Maybe," Gideon said, "but it is my mistake to make." The man glared at him, then turned and stalked out of the kitchen. A moment later there was the sound of shouting, the thunder of hooves, and then silence. Zara slid down the wall, her legs giving out. Her whole body was shaking, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She was dimly aware of Mrs. Calloway kneeling beside her, but it was Gideon's voice she heard, low and steady. "You are safe," he said. "They are gone." Zara looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. "Why did you do that?" Gideon crouched down in front of her, his expression gentle. Because it was the right thing to do. Her hands were trembling so badly she could not make them stop. She clenched them into fists, pressing them against her knees, but it was no use. Gideon reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he covered her hands with his own. His palms were warm and calloused, his grip firm but not restraining. "Peace starts here," he said quietly. "You do not have to be afraid anymore." Zara stared at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and something inside her cracked. The tears came then, hot and unwelcome, and she could not stop them. Gideon did not try to comfort her with empty words. He just held her hands, steady and sure, until the storm passed. Later, after Mrs. Calloway had helped her to her room and Gideon had gone to speak with the marshal, Zara lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but she could still feel the warmth of his touch, the weight of his words. "Peace starts here." She did not know if she believed him, but for the first time in 5 years, she wanted to. The next morning, Zara woke to find the boarding house abuzz with gossip. The Miller gang had been caught on the outskirts of town by a posse led by Gideon Abbott. There had been a brief shootout, and 2 of the gang members were dead. The rest, including the man who had grabbed Zara, were now in the marshal's custody, awaiting transport to the territorial prison in Laramie. Mrs. Calloway was practically glowing with relief as she recounted the story to Zara over breakfast. "Mr. Abbott is a hero," she said. "He organized the whole thing. Turns out he used to be a ranger down in Texas. Can you imagine?" Zara could imagine. It explained the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him. She wondered why he had left Texas, why he was working as a ranch hand in Wyoming, but she did not ask. Everyone had secrets in the West. That was part of the appeal. She did not see Gideon for several days, and she told herself it was for the best. He had helped her, and she was grateful, but gratitude was not the same as trust. She had trusted before, and it had nearly killed her. But Gideon had other ideas. He appeared at the boarding house on a Saturday afternoon, cleaned up and wearing a fresh shirt. Mrs. Calloway let him in with a knowing smile, and Zara found herself being summoned from the kitchen. "Mr. Abbott is here to see you, dear," Mrs. Calloway said, her eyes twinkling. Zara wiped her hands on her apron and went to the parlor, where Gideon was standing by the window. He turned when she entered, his hat in his hands. "Miss Garrett," he said, his voice formal, "I hope I am not intruding." "What do you want?" Zara asked, more bluntly than she intended. Gideon did not seem offended. "I wanted to see how you were doing after the other night." "I am fine." He studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her. "You do not look fine," Zara bristled. "I said I am fine." Gideon sighed and set his hat on a side table. "Look, I know we do not know each other, and I know you have no reason to trust me, but I also know what it looks like when someone has been hurt, and I am not talking about a bruise or a broken bone. I am talking about the kind of hurt that does not heal, the kind that makes you afraid of your own shadow." Zara's throat tightened. "You do not know anything about me." "You are right," Gideon said. "I do not, but I would like to if you would let me." She stared at him, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave, to go back to his ranch and forget about her. But another part, a part she had thought was dead, wanted to say yes, wanted to take the risk. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why do you care?" Gideon hesitated, and for the first time she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I have been where you are," he said quietly. "Not the same, maybe, but close enough. And someone helped me when I needed it. I figure it is my turn to do the same." Zara did not know what to say to that. She looked down at her hands, at the faint scars on her knuckles, and made a decision that terrified her. "All right," she said, "but I am not making any promises. A slow smile spread across Gideon's face, and it transformed him. He looked younger, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "That is all I am asking." They started slowly. Gideon would stop by the boarding house once or twice a week, always polite, always respectful. He never stayed long, just long enough to talk for a few minutes or to bring Zara something he thought she might like. A book, a jar of honey, a bundle of wildflowers. She accepted his gifts with a mixture of suspicion and wonder, unsure of what he wanted from her. But as the weeks passed, she began to relax around him. He never pushed her to talk about her past, never asked questions she was not ready to answer. Instead, he told her about his own life, growing up on a ranch in Texas, joining the Rangers when he was 19, leaving after a botched mission that had cost the lives of 2 of his friends. He spoke plainly, without self-pity, and Zara found herself drawn to his honesty. "Why did you come to Wyoming?" she asked one afternoon. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house watching the sun set over the mountains. Gideon leaned back in his chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "Needed a change," he said. "Texas had too many ghosts." Zara understood that. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I like it here. It is quieter, simpler." "Simpler?" Zara raised an eyebrow. "You organized a posse to take down a gang of outlaws. That does not sound simple." Gideon laughed, a deep, rich sound that made her smile despite herself. "Fair point, but most days it is just me and the cattle and the sky. That is simple enough for me." Zara looked out at the mountains, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. "I have never lived anywhere quiet," she said. "The mining town where I grew up was loud and dirty, and then I married Daniel, and his idea of quiet was passing out drunk on the floor." It was the first time she had mentioned her husband, and she felt Gideon's attention sharpen. But he did not press her. He just nodded and said, "Sounds like you are better off without him." "He is dead," Zara said flatly. "Alcohol poisoning. The doctor said his liver gave out." "I am sorry," Gideon said, and she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "I am not," Zara said, and it was the truth. "I know that makes me a terrible person, but I am not sorry he is gone. I am just sorry I wasted 5 years of my life being afraid of him." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are not a terrible person, Zara. You are a survivor." "There is a difference." Zara looked at him, at the steady gray of his eyes, and felt something shift inside her. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a tiny flicker of hope. Winter came hard and fast that year, blanketing Medicine Bow in snow and driving the temperature down to dangerous lows. The boarding house was warm and cozy, the stove in the kitchen always burning, but Zara found herself restless. She had grown used to Gideon's visits, and when the snow made travel difficult, she missed him more than she wanted to admit. It was late December when he finally managed to make it back to town. He arrived on horseback, his coat covered in snow, his breath misting in the cold air. Zara saw him from the kitchen window and felt her heart leap. She told herself it was just relief, just the gladness of seeing a friend, but she knew it was more than that. Gideon stamped the snow off his boots and came inside, his cheeks red from the cold. "Afternoon, Mrs. Calloway," he said, tipping his hat. "Miss Garrett. Goodness, you must be frozen," Mrs. Calloway said, bustling over with a cup of hot coffee. Sit down, sit down. Zara, fetch Mr. Abbott some stew." Zara ladled stew into a bowl and brought it to the table where Gideon was already seated. He thanked her with a smile, and she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. After he had eaten, Gideon asked if Zara would take a walk with him. She hesitated, glancing at the window where snow was falling in thick, lazy flakes. "It is freezing outside." "I will keep you warm," Gideon said, and there was a teasing glint in his eyes that made her laugh. They bundled up and stepped out into the cold. The town was quiet, the snow muffling sound, and it felt like they were the only two people in the world. They walked slowly, their boots crunching in the snow, and Gideon told her about the ranch, about the foals that had been born in the spring and the new barn they were building. "You should come visit," he said. "When the weather clears. I think you would like it." Zara glanced at him. "Why would I like it?" "Because it is peaceful," Gideon said, "and because I think you could use some peace." She did not argue. They walked in silence for a while, and then Gideon stopped, turning to face her. "Zara, can I ask you something?" "You just did," she said, but her tone was gentle. He smiled. "Fair enough. Can I ask you something else?" "That depends on the question." Gideon took a breath, and she could see the nervousness in his eyes. "Do you think you could ever see me as more than a friend?" Zara's heart stopped. She had known this was coming, had felt it building between them for weeks, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I have not thought about that kind of thing in a long time." "I understand," Gideon said, "and I am not asking you to decide right now. I just wanted you to know that I care about you. More than I probably should, considering we have only known each other a few months. But I do." Zara looked at him, at the snowflakes caught in his hair, at the vulnerability in his expression, and felt something break open inside her. "I care about you too," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "But I am scared, Gideon. I am so scared of being hurt again." Gideon reached out and took her hands in his, just as he had that night in the kitchen. "I know," he said. "And I am not going to lie and tell you that I will never hurt you because people make mistakes. But I promise you this. I will never raise a hand to you. I will never make you afraid. And if you ever want me to leave, all you have to do is say the word." Zara's hands trembled, but not from fear this time. It was something else, something fragile and new. "What if I am not strong enough?" she whispered. "You are," Gideon said, his voice firm. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth there, saw the unwavering belief he had in her. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it too. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Gideon's face lit up and he pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her like a shield. Zara stiffened at first, the instinct to pull away almost overwhelming, but then she relaxed, letting herself lean into his warmth. He smelled like leather and wood smoke, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, she could get used to this. They courted through the winter, a slow and careful dance that suited them both. Gideon was patient, never pushing for more than Zara was ready to give, and Zara found herself opening up in ways she had not thought possible. She told him about her childhood, about the father who had worked himself to death in the mines and the mother who had followed him to the grave a year later. She told him about meeting Daniel, about how charming he had been at first, how he had promised her a better life. And she told him about the first time Daniel had hit her, about the shame and the fear and the years of convincing herself that it was her fault. Gideon listened without judgment, his hand holding hers, and when she was finished, he said, "None of that was your fault, Zara. None of it." She wanted to believe him, and slowly she was starting to. Spring arrived with a burst of color, the wildflowers blooming across the prairie like a patchwork quilt. Gideon kept his promise and invited Zara to visit the Three Bars Ranch. She accepted, her nerves fluttering as Mrs. Calloway loaned her the boarding house's wagon and a gentle mare named Daisy. The ranch was everything Gideon had described, sprawling and peaceful, with wide open spaces that seemed to stretch forever. The main house was a sturdy log structure, and there were several outbuildings scattered across the property. Gideon met her at the gate, his smile bright and welcoming. "You made it," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "I did," Zara said, looking around. "It is beautiful." Gideon showed her around, introducing her to the ranch hands and the herd of cattle that grazed in the distance. They had lunch under a cottonwood tree, and Zara felt something she had not felt in years: contentment. "I could get used to this," she said, leaning back against the tree trunk. Gideon grinned. "That is the idea." As the weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened. Gideon kissed her for the first time on a warm evening in May, under a sky full of stars. It was gentle and sweet, and Zara felt tears prick her eyes at the tenderness of it. She kissed him back, pouring all her hope and fear and longing into that single moment. "I love you," Gideon said when they finally pulled apart, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you too," Zara whispered, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They were married in June, a simple ceremony at the small church in Medicine Bow. Mrs. Calloway stood as Zara's witness, and one of the ranch hands stood for Gideon. The reverend was old and kind, his voice steady as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Gideon kissed her, Zara felt the last of her fear melt away, replaced by a joy so fierce it took her breath away. They moved into the ranch house, and Zara threw herself into making it a home. She planted a garden, learned to ride, and even helped with the cattle when the hands were short-staffed. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and she loved every minute of it. Life was not perfect. There were days when the memories crept back, when a sudden noise or a raised voice made her flinch. But Gideon was always there, his presence a steady anchor, reminding her that she was safe. And slowly, so slowly she barely noticed, the trembling in her hands stopped. A year after their wedding, Zara discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified at first, afraid of what kind of mother she would be, afraid of bringing a child into a world that had been so cruel to her. But Gideon held her close and told her that they would figure it out together. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy baby boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Gideon's father, and Zara fell in love with him the moment she held him in her arms. She marveled at his tiny fingers, his perfect little nose, and the way he looked at her with complete trust. "You are going to be a wonderful mother," Gideon said, watching her with a soft smile. "I hope so," Zara said, her voice thick with emotion. She was. Motherhood came more naturally than she had expected, and she found a fierce protectiveness in herself that she had not known existed. Samuel was a happy baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and he brought a light into their lives that Zara had not known was possible. The years passed in a blur of seasons. Samuel grew into a curious, adventurous toddler, always underfoot and always asking questions. Zara and Gideon had 2 more children, a daughter named Lily in 1882 and another son, James, in 1884. The ranch prospered, and Gideon's reputation as a fair and hard-working rancher spread throughout the territory. Zara often thought back to that night in the boarding house, to the moment when Gideon had held her trembling hands and told her that peace started here. He had been right. The peace had started that night, and it had grown, slowly and steadily, into a life she had never dared to dream of. One evening, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Zara and Gideon sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and thought about how far she had come. "You ever think about the past?" she asked. "Sometimes," Gideon said, "but mostly I think about the future." Zara smiled. "What do you see when you think about the future?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I see us growing old together. I see our children grown with families of their own. I see a life full of love and laughter and hard work. And I see you happy and at peace." Zara's throat tightened with emotion. "That sounds perfect." "It does not it?" Gideon said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They sat in comfortable silence, the sky turning from orange to purple to deep indigo. Zara thought about the girl she had been, the one who had scrubbed her hands raw trying to wash away the past. She thought about the fear that had ruled her life for so long, the trembling that had seemed like it would never stop. And she thought about Gideon, the cowboy who had held her steady and shown her that peace was not just a dream, but a reality within reach. As the years continued to unfold, Zara became a pillar of the community. She organized church socials, helped new families settle in the area, and became known for her kindness and generosity. The trembling hands that had once been a constant reminder of her past were now steady and sure, capable of holding her children, tending her garden, and reaching out to those in need. Samuel grew into a strong, responsible young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Lily inherited her mother's compassion and her father's determination, and she dreamed of becoming a teacher. James was the wild one, always getting into mischief, but with a heart of gold that reminded Zara so much of Gideon. In 1890, when Samuel was 10, the family took a trip to Cheyenne for the territorial fair. It was a grand adventure, and the children were wide-eyed with excitement at the crowds and the exhibits. Zara held Gideon's hand as they walked through the fairgrounds, marveling at how different her life was now compared to what it had been. "Happy?" Gideon asked, squeezing her hand. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Zara said, and she meant it. That night, as they lay in the hotel room with the children asleep in the adjoining room, Gideon pulled Zara close. "I am proud of you," he said. "You have come so far." Zara smiled in the darkness. "We have come so far. I could not have done it without you." "We did it together," Gideon said. "And we will keep doing it together, for as long as we both shall live." Zara kissed him, a long, lingering kiss that spoke of love and gratitude and a future that stretched out before them like the wide Wyoming sky. She had learned that peace was not a destination, but a journey, one that required courage and trust and the willingness to let go of the past. And she had learned that love, real love, was not about possession or control, but about holding someone steady when they needed it most and letting them soar when they were ready. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. There were hard times, droughts that tested the ranch, illnesses that scared them, and the inevitable losses that came with life. But through it all, Zara and Gideon faced everything together, their love a constant foundation that never wavered. In 1895, Samuel announced his intention to marry a sweet girl named Emma from a neighboring ranch. Zara helped plan the wedding, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her son say his vows. Lily went off to Denver to attend a teaching college, and James, at 11, was already showing signs of being a natural horseman. Zara was 40 years old now, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw a different woman than the one who had arrived in Medicine Bow all those years ago. There were lines around her eyes and threads of gray in her hair, but there was also a light in her gaze that had not been there before, a confidence and peace that came from knowing she was loved and valued. One autumn afternoon, as she was working in the garden, she heard the sound of hooves and looked up to see Gideon riding toward the house. He dismounted and walked over to her, his movements slower than they had been in his younger days but still strong and sure. "Come with me," he said, offering his hand. "I want to show you something." Zara wiped the dirt from her hands and took his hand, letting him lead her to the top of a nearby hill. From there, they could see the entire ranch spread out before them, the house, the barns, the cattle grazing in the distance, and the mountains rising majestically in the background. "This is what we built," Gideon said, his arm around her waist. "Together." Zara leaned into him, her heart full. "It is more than I ever dreamed of." "You deserve it," Gideon said. "All of it and more." They stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Zara thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the fear and the pain and the slow, painful process of healing. She thought about the moment when Gideon had held her trembling hands and promised her that peace started here. And she thought about how that promise had become a reality, one day at a time, one moment at a time. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me when I could not believe in myself." Gideon turned to her, his eyes tender. "You always had it in you, Zara. I just helped you see it." She kissed him then, a kiss full of love and gratitude and the deep, abiding contentment that came from a life well lived. They had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone. And as they walked back down the hill hand in hand, Zara knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, just as they always had. The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and the ranch thrived under their care. Samuel and Emma had their first child, a daughter they named Zara. And when Zara held her granddaughter for the first time, she wept with joy. Lily returned from Denver with a teaching certificate and took a position at the school in Medicine Bow. James, true to form, left for a year to work on a cattle drive, but he returned with stories and a newfound maturity that made his parents proud. In 1898, Wyoming became a state, and the celebration in Medicine Bow was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Zara and Gideon attended the festivities with their children and grandchildren, and as they watched the fireworks light up the night sky, Zara felt a profound sense of belonging. This was her home, these were her people, and this was the life she had fought so hard to build. As they grew older, Zara and Gideon settled into a comfortable routine. They spent their mornings working on the ranch, their afternoons with their grandchildren, and their evenings on the porch, watching the sun set and talking about everything and nothing. They had been married for over 20 years, and their love had only deepened with time. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Gideon took Zara's hand and looked at her with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked. Zara laughed. "How could I forget? I ran into you on the street and nearly fell over." "You were so scared," Gideon said, his voice soft. "I could see it in your eyes." "I was," Zara admitted. "I was scared of everything back then." "And now?" Gideon asked. Zara looked out at the land they had built together, at the life they had created, and smiled. "Now I am not scared anymore. Now I am just grateful." Gideon squeezed her hand. "So am I." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Zara thought about all the moments that had led them to this place, the fear, the hope, the love, the healing. She thought about the trembling hands that had once defined her and the steady hands that now held hers. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I love you too," Gideon said. "More than words can say." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Zara leaned against Gideon, her heart full of peace. She had come so far from the frightened woman she had been, and she knew that it was all because of the man sitting beside her. He had held her steady when she needed it most, and in doing so, he had shown her that peace was not something to be found, but something to be built, one moment at a time. The years rolled on, bringing with them the inevitable changes that came with the passage of time. Samuel took over more of the ranch's daily operations, allowing Gideon to slow down and enjoy the fruits of his labor. Lily married a kind man named Robert, a lawyer from Cheyenne, and they settled in Medicine Bow, giving Zara even more grandchildren to dote on. James eventually married a spirited woman named Clara, and they built a small homestead on the edge of the ranch property. Zara and Gideon became the patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling family, their home always filled with laughter and noise. They celebrated birthdays and holidays together, and every Sunday, the entire family gathered for dinner at the ranch house. Zara loved these gatherings, loved seeing her children and grandchildren happy and healthy, loved knowing that she had played a part in creating this legacy of love and stability. In 1902, when Zara was 47 and Gideon was 51, they celebrated their silver wedding anniversary. Their children threw them a grand party, inviting half the town to join in the celebration. There was music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. Zara wore a new dress, a deep blue that matched her eyes, and Gideon wore his best suit. They danced together under the stars, and Zara felt like the luckiest woman in the world. 25 years, Gideon said, his arms around her. Can you believe it? Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, Zara said, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. Here is to 25 more, Gideon said, and he kissed her, right there in front of everyone. The crowd cheered and Zara laughed, her heart overflowing with love. She had never imagined that her life could be this full, this rich, this beautiful. And she knew that it was all because she had taken a chance on love, on trust, on the possibility of peace. As they grew older, their pace slowed, but their love remained constant. They spent more time on the porch, watching the grandchildren play, and less time working the ranch. Gideon's hair had gone completely gray, and Zara's once dark locks were now streaked with silver, but they still held hands like newlyweds, still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking. In the winter of 1905, Gideon fell ill with pneumonia. The doctor came and went, shaking his head and saying there was little he could do. Zara refused to leave Gideon's side, sitting by his bed and holding his hand, just as he had once held hers. She whispered to him about the life they had built, about the children and grandchildren who loved him, about the legacy he was leaving behind. "You cannot leave me," she said, her voice breaking. "Not yet." Gideon squeezed her hand weakly. "I am not going anywhere," he said, his voice hoarse. "I still have too much to live for." And miraculously, he recovered. It took weeks, but slowly his strength returned, and by spring he was back on his feet, albeit a bit more cautious than before. Zara thanked God every day for giving her more time with the man she loved. They made the most of the years they had left. They traveled a bit, visiting Lily in Cheyenne and taking a trip to Denver to see the sights. They spoiled their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who adored them. And they continued to sit on the porch every evening, watching the sun set and talking about the day. In 1910, when Zara was 55 and Gideon was 59, they celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. It was a quieter affair than their silver anniversary, just family and a few close friends, but it was no less meaningful. Zara looked around at the faces she loved, at the life she had built, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "You know," she said to Gideon later that night, "I used to think that happiness was something that happened to other people. I never thought it would happen to me." "And now?" Gideon asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Now I know that happiness is not something that happens," Zara said. "It is something you create, something you build with the people you love." Gideon kissed the top of her head. "You are a wise woman, Zara Abbott." "I learned from the best," Zara said, smiling up at him. As the years continued to pass, Zara and Gideon watched their family grow and flourish. Samuel's daughter, little Zara, grew into a beautiful young woman who reminded everyone of her grandmother. Lily's children were smart and ambitious, and James's sons were natural ranchers, carrying on the family tradition. There were marriages and births, laughter and tears, and through it all, Zara and Gideon remained the anchor, the steady presence that held everyone together. In 1915, when Zara was 60 and Gideon was 64, they took a trip back to Medicine Bow, which had grown considerably since they had first arrived. The boarding house where Zara had worked was still standing, though Mrs. Calloway had long since passed away. They walked through the town, remembering the people and the moments that had shaped their lives. "It is strange," Zara said, standing in front of the boarding house, "to think that this is where it all started." "Not so strange," Gideon said. "It was where you found the courage to start again." Zara looked at him, at the man who had held her steady all those years ago and who continued to hold her steady still. "And where I found you. Best decision you ever made," Gideon said with a grin. Zara laughed, modest as ever. They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, their steps slower now but no less sure. The years had been kind to them, giving them a life filled with love and purpose. And as they sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun set one more time, Zara thought about the words Gideon had spoken to her all those years ago. Peace starts here. He had been right. Peace had started with that moment, with his steady hands holding hers, with his quiet promise that she did not have to be afraid anymore. And it had grown, blossoming into a life that was rich and full and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. "Thank you," she said softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "For what?" Gideon asked. "For everything," Zara said. "For loving me, for believing in me, for building this life with me." Gideon turned to her, his eyes shining with love. "Thank you for letting me. For taking a chance on a broken-down cowboy who did not know what he was doing half the time." Zara smiled. "You always knew exactly what you were doing." "Maybe," Gideon said, "or maybe I just got lucky." "We both got lucky," Zara said, and she kissed him, a gentle kiss that spoke of a lifetime of love and devotion. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Zara felt a sense of completeness, a deep and abiding peace that came from a life well lived. She had started as a frightened woman with trembling hands, but she had become someone strong and capable, someone who had built a legacy of love and stability. And it was all because of the man beside her, the cowboy who had held her steady and shown her that peace was not a destination, but a journey. In the years that followed, Zara and Gideon continued to live out their days surrounded by family and love. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1920, and by then, they had a dozen grandchildren and several great-grandchildren. The ranch was thriving under Samuel's management, and the family name was respected throughout the territory. Gideon's health began to decline in the early 1920s, and by 1923, it was clear that his time was growing short. He faced the end with the same quiet courage he had faced everything else in his life, and Zara stayed by his side, holding his hand and telling him stories about their life together. "You know," Gideon said one afternoon, his voice weak, "I have no regrets, none at all." "Neither do I," Zara said, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me everything I ever wanted and more." "You did the same for me," Gideon said, squeezing her hand. "You made my life worth living." He passed away peacefully in his sleep a few days later, surrounded by his family. Zara was heartbroken, but she took comfort in knowing that they had had a long and happy life together, that they had built something beautiful that would last long after they were gone. She continued to live on the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She spent her days working in her garden, reading to the great-grandchildren, and sitting on the porch in the evenings, remembering the man she had loved with all her heart. She lived for another 10 years, and when she passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1933 at the age of 78, she was buried beside Gideon on the hill overlooking the ranch. Their legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the ranch they had built, and in the love they had shared. And every time someone in the family faced fear or uncertainty, they remembered the story of Zara and Gideon, of the woman whose hands had trembled from years of fear, and the cowboy who had held them steady and said, "Peace starts here." It was a reminder that love could heal, that courage could be found, and that peace was always within reach for those brave enough to seek it. The ranch continued to prosper for generations, and the Abbott name became synonymous with integrity and hard work. Zara and Gideon's story was passed down through the years, becoming a cherished part of the family history. And on warm summer evenings, when the sun set over the mountains and the stars began to appear, you could almost feel their presence, standing on that hill, hand in hand, watching over the life they had built together. Their love story became a testament to the power of hope, the strength of the human spirit, and the transformative nature of true love. It was a story about finding peace in the midst of chaos, about building a life from the ashes of pain, and about the courage it takes to trust again. And it all started with a simple moment when a cowboy held a frightened woman's trembling hands and promised her that peace started here. And it did. In that moment, and in all the moments that followed, peace became a reality. Not because life was perfect or easy, but because they faced it together, with love as their foundation and hope as their guide. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and created something beautiful, something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. The story of Zara and Gideon Abbott became a legend in medicine, bow, and beyond, a reminder that no matter how dark the past, no matter how deep the fear, there is always hope for a better future. All it takes is courage, faith, and the willingness to let someone hold your hand when you need it most. Their love transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched, creating a ripple effect that spread through generations. And so, as the sun set on the Wyoming prairie one final time in this telling of their story, we are reminded that love is the greatest force in the universe, capable of healing the deepest wounds and bringing peace to the most troubled hearts. Zara and Gideon proved that with courage and faith, anyone can overcome their past and build a future filled with joy and purpose. Their story ended not with sorrow, but with celebration, a celebration of a life well lived, of love well given, and of peace finally found. They had started with nothing but fear and hope, and they had built an empire of love that would stand the test of time. And in the end, that was all that mattered, not the money or the land or the legacy, but the love they had shared and the peace they had found together. As their great-great-grandchildren played in the fields where Zara had once planted her garden, as the cattle grazed on the hills where Gideon had once ridden, the spirit of their love lived on. It was in the laughter of children, in the warmth of family gatherings, in the quiet moments on the porch when couples held hands and watched the sun set. It was in every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every time someone chose love over fear. Zara's hands had trembled from years of fear, but Gideon had held them steady and said, "Peace starts here." And peace had indeed started there, in that moment, in that place, with those two people. It had grown and flourished, spreading like wildflowers across the prairie, touching lives and changing hearts. Their story was a reminder that no matter how broken we may feel, no matter how lost we may be, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of peace. There is always the chance for love. And so their story ended as all good love stories should, with two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together filled with joy and purpose, who had loved each other through the good times and the bad, and who had left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. They had proved that peace was not just a dream, but a reality that could be achieved through courage, faith, and love. Their house still stood on the hill, weathered by time but strong and solid, a testament to everything they had built. Inside, photographs lined the walls, capturing moments of joy and love. Weddings and births, holidays and celebrations, ordinary moments made extraordinary by the love that surrounded them. And if you listened carefully on a quiet evening, you could almost hear their voices, laughing and talking, sharing stories and dreams, living the life they had fought so hard to create. The ranch continued to thrive, managed now by the fourth and fifth generations of Abbotts, all of them carrying forward the values that Zara and Gideon had instilled. Hard work, integrity, compassion, and above all, love. The family gathered every year on the anniversary of Zara and Gideon's wedding, sharing stories and keeping their memory alive. The youngest children would ask to hear the story again and again, never tiring of the tale of the woman whose hands had trembled and the cowboy who had held them steady. And every time the story was told, it reminded them of what was truly important in life. Not wealth or power or fame, but love and family and the courage to face your fears. It reminded them that peace was always possible, that healing was always within reach, that no matter how dark the night, dawn would always come. Zara and Gideon's grave on the hill became a place of pilgrimage for the family, a place to remember and reflect, to give thanks for the legacy they had left behind. The headstone was simple, bearing only their names and the dates of their births and deaths, but beneath it was carved a single line: "Peace starts here." It was a reminder of the moment that had changed everything, the moment when fear had given way to hope, when trembling had given way to steadiness, when loneliness had given way to love. As the sun set on the ranch one final time in this telling, casting long shadows across the land, the legacy of Zara and Gideon Abbott stood as a beacon of hope. Their story proved that no matter where you come from, no matter what you have endured, you have the power to create a better future. All it takes is courage, faith, and someone willing to hold your hand when you need it most. And so we leave them there, on that hill overlooking the ranch, their spirits watching over the family they created, the love they shared living on in every heart they touched. Their story is complete, their journey finished, their peace finally and fully realized. They had started with nothing but fear and hope, and they had ended with everything that mattered: love, family, purpose, and peace. In the end, that is what every heart seeks, not just to survive but to thrive, not just to endure but to flourish, not just to exist but to live fully and completely, surrounded by love and purpose. Zara and Gideon found that, created that, and left it as a gift for all who came after them. Their story is a reminder that no matter how difficult the journey, no matter how steep the climb, the destination is always worth it. Peace starts here. Those three simple words changed everything for Zara, and they can change everything for anyone who has the courage to believe them. Peace starts in the moment we choose to let go of fear, to trust in love, to open our hearts to the possibility of something better. It starts with a single choice, a single moment, a single act of courage, and from that moment, everything else flows. Zara and Gideon's love story stands as a testament to the transformative power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the endless possibilities that await those brave enough to seek them. They built a life from broken pieces, created beauty from ashes, and proved that no matter how dark the past, the future can always be brighter. Their story is finished now, complete and whole, with no threads left hanging, no questions left unanswered. They lived, they loved, they built a legacy that will endure for generations. And in doing so, they showed us all what is possible when we choose courage over fear, love over hate, hope over despair. The sun has set on their story, but their light continues to shine, illuminating the path for all who come after them. And somewhere on that hill in Wyoming, their spirits rest in peace together at last, their hands no longer trembling, their hearts no longer afraid, their love eternal and unchanging. Peace starts here. And for Zara and Gideon Abbott, peace had truly started there, in Medicine Bow, Wyoming, in the year 1878, with a trembling woman and a steady cowboy who believed in the power of love. Their story is complete, their ending is happy, and their legacy lives on forever.